The morning of the auction, there were 1,000 chicks nobody wanted. They sat in a stack of shallow cardboard flats at the back of the Madison County livestock barn, peeping in that thin, uneven way chicks peep when they are cold and underfed, and the men gathered around the front pens did not even bother to walk back and look. Word had already gone around. The hatchery up in Tennessee had a bad week, something with the incubators running too cool, and the batch had hatched late and weak. 2 had already died in the flat closest to the door. The auctioneer had tried to sell them as one lot at the start of the morning and gotten no bids. He had tried again at half price. Then he had set them aside and moved on to the calves, which was where the real money was, and which was where Hollis Pemberton was standing in his clean Carhartt jacket, with his thumbs hooked into his belt loops like a man who had never in his life had to wait for anything. She came in around 9. 22 years old, narrow through the shoulders, hair tied back under a feed store cap that had belonged to somebody else first. Her name was Wren Caldwell, and most of the men in the barn knew her only as Edna Caldwell's granddaughter, the one who had come back from Knoxville after her mother passed and was living up at the old place on Burnt Fork Road by herself. She walked past the calf pens without stopping. She walked past the goats. She walked all the way to the back where the cardboard flats sat under a buzzing fluorescent, and she crouched down on her heels, and she looked at those 1,000 chicks for a long time without saying anything. A long time. Long enough that the auctioneer's helper, a boy named Caleb, who could not have been more than 17, came over and asked her if she was all right. She said she was. She asked him what the hatchery wanted for the lot. He told her they had said anything. Just take them. They were going to be cold by noon. She stood up and walked to the office and came back 10 minutes later with a receipt for $40 and a borrowed handcart, and she began loading those flats one at a time into the bed of a Ford pickup that was older than she was. Hollis Pemberton watched her from across the barn, with the half-smile of a man who has just been handed a story to tell at supper. He waited until she had loaded the last flat, and then he walked over and said, loud enough for the 3 men beside him to hear, "You know those things are going to be dead by Sunday." She closed the tailgate. She said, "That's one approach." He laughed. He said, "Sweetheart, that ain't an approach. That's a fact." She got in the truck and shut the door and drove out of the lot, and Hollis Pemberton turned to the men beside him and said, "That girl just paid $40 for 1,000 funerals." He had meant it as a prediction of failure. It would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely. If this is the kind of story you stay for, do me a small favor and tap the like button and drop a comment telling me what town you are watching from. I read them. Everyone. Now let's get back to it. She drove the 40 minutes back to Burnt Fork Road with the windows cracked so the chicks would have air, and the peeping rose and fell behind her like weather. The road climbed past the old Tilson place and crossed the creek twice and finally narrowed into the gravel switchbacks that led up to the ridge where her grandfather had built the farmhouse in 1948, out of chestnut salvaged from a barn that had stood on the same footprint for 60 years before him. The house was still standing. Most everything else was not. The big tobacco barn had collapsed in on itself the winter before last. The smokehouse leaned. The chicken house, a long, low building of board and batten that her grandfather had built specifically and stubbornly to a design nobody else in the county used, was still upright. But it had not held a living bird in 11 years. Wren parked the truck at the edge of the yard, and she carried the flats one by one into that long, low building, and she set them on the wooden floor her grandfather had laid, and she stood there in the cool dim with the smell of old straw and older wood, and she listened to 1,000 chicks she had paid $40 for, and she did not feel afraid exactly. but she felt the weight of the thing settle on her shoulders, the way a coat settles when you have been carrying it folded over your arm. She had come back to Burnt Fork in March, after her mother's funeral, not because she had a plan, but because there was nowhere else that felt like it would hold her. Her grandmother Edna was 81 and lived in the small frame house at the bottom of the ridge, and the big house on top, the one her grandfather Asa had built, had been sitting empty since he died. Wren had moved into it with 2 suitcases and a box of her mother's books, and had spent the first month simply walking the property, learning where the springs ran and where the deer crossed, sitting on the porch in the evenings and watching the light leave the mountains. She had not known, in March, what she was going to do with any of it. She had only known that the city had not held her either, and that the small inheritance her mother had left was not going to last forever, and that something would have to be made of this place, or it would go the way of the tobacco barn. The chicks had not been her plan. She had gone to the auction that morning to look at a milk cow she could not afford, and had come home with 1,000 sick birds instead. And if you had asked her in that long, low building why she had done it, she could not have given you an answer that would have satisfied Hollis Pemberton or anybody like him. She could only have said that she had crouched down and looked at them and seen something the rest of the barn had not seen, which was that they were not dying. They were only cold and hungry and the wrong color for what people wanted, which was the bright industrial yellow of a healthy Cornish cross. These were a mixed lot of heritage breeds the hatchery had been trying to clear out, mottled and dun and rust-colored, with the wrong leg coloring and the wrong comb shapes and the wrong everything. And the cool incubators had only finished what the market had already started. She lit the brooder lamps her grandfather had left hanging from the rafters. She filled the long wooden troughs with warm water and crushed grain. She sat on an overturned bucket in the middle of that building until well after dark, and she watched 1,000 chicks slowly remember that they were alive. Edna came up the ridge the next morning, carrying a tin of biscuits and a thermos of coffee, the way she came up every Tuesday, and she stood in the doorway of the long, low building, and she looked at the chicks for almost as long as Wren had looked at them at the barn. Edna was a small woman, narrow as her granddaughter, and built of the same patient bone, and she wore the same brown coveralls she had worn for 40 years, without self-consciousness, because she had earned the right. She did not ask Wren what she had been thinking. She did not ask how much they had cost. She walked the length of the building once, slowly, stopping at each brooder lamp and looking up at the rafters, and she came back to the doorway and she said, "Your grandfather built this house for these." Wren looked at her. Edna pointed up at the eaves, where Asa had set the vents at a particular height, and at the wooden floor he had laid on cedar sleepers 2 feet off the ground, and at the southern wall he had hung with shutters that could be raised and lowered by a single rope. He was particular, Edna said. He read books nobody else read. Wren asked what kind of books. Edna said, the kind that said the breeds people were giving up on were the ones that would matter again. She looked at the chicks one more time and she said, "Those are the ones." Then she set the biscuits on the workbench and she walked back down the ridge to her own kitchen, and she did not come back up for 3 days, which was the longest she had ever gone without checking on Wren since March, and Wren understood, without being told, that her grandmother was giving her room. She spent those 3 days the way a person spends days when something living has been put into their hands. She kept the brooder lamps at the right height by climbing up on a stepladder twice a day and adjusting the chains. She mixed the feed by hand, adding crumbled hard-boiled egg the first week, the way an old extension bulletin from 1962 she found in a kitchen drawer said to do. She lost 43 chicks the first 10 days, which was less than she had braced for, and more than she wanted to remember, and she carried each one out behind the building and buried them in a row at the edge of the woods, because she could not bring herself to do otherwise. She did not name them. She held that line. She almost held that line. There was a small, rust-colored pullet with a crooked toe that followed her along the inside of the wire whenever she walked past, and that one she called Pin, which was short for nothing, and which she said only to herself. By the end of the 3rd week, the brooder lamps were off during the day. By the end of the 5th week, the chicks had moved out into the fenced run that ran the length of the south wall. By the end of the 7th week, they were birds, not chicks, with feathers coming in, mottled and rust and dun and slate, and they were the strangest-looking flock Madison County had seen in a generation, and they were, every one of the 957 survivors, alive. Word got around the way word gets around. Caleb, the auctioneer's helper, mentioned to his mother that the Caldwell girl had not lost the chicks like everybody said she would, and his mother mentioned it at the beauty shop, and from the beauty shop it travelled to the gas station out at the crossroads, where a woman named Doris Hensley ran the register and knew everything about everybody within a 12-mile radius. Doris told Hollis Pemberton when he came in for his Wednesday coffee, and Hollis snorted and said, "Alive ain't the same as worth anything. You wait." He was not wrong, in a narrow sense. The birds were alive, but they were not yet anything else. They were not laying. They were not big enough to butcher. They were 957 mouths that needed feeding twice a day, and feed cost money, and the small inheritance was a smaller inheritance every week. Wren sat at her grandfather's kitchen table on Sunday nights, with a green cloth-bound notebook open in front of her, and she wrote down every dollar that went out and every dollar that did not come in, and she watched the column on the left grow and the column on the right stay blank, and she did not panic, because panicking was not a thing her family had ever found useful. Instead, she went looking. She went up into the attic of the big house, which she had not yet had the heart to sort through, and she spent 4 cold evenings in October going through the wooden trunks her grandfather had left up there, looking for the books Edna had said he read. She found them in the 3rd trunk, beneath a folded wool blanket that smelled of cedar. There were a dozen of them, slim and cloth-bound, with titles like Standard of Perfection and The Dual-Purpose Fowl, and one in particular, hand-stitched and clearly older than the rest, that had no title on the cover at all, but had Asa Caldwell written inside the front board in pencil, in his careful slanting hand. It was a notebook. It was 40 years of a notebook. He had begun it in 1961, and had written in it in fits and starts until the year he died, and it was a record of every breeding pair he had ever kept, every cross he had ever made, every observation he had ever bothered to set down, and it was also, Wren realized, as she read it by lamplight at the kitchen table that first long November night, an argument. Her grandfather had been arguing, quietly and only with himself and the page, that the country was going to need these birds again. He wrote about pests. He wrote about how the broiler operations down in the valley sprayed their grounds with poisons that killed everything that walked or crawled, and how the heritage flocks his own father had kept had done that work for free, eating the ticks and the beetles and the grasshoppers down to nothing, and how the day was coming, he wrote in 1978, and again in 1983, and again in 1991, when the bugs would come back stronger than the poison, and the people with the right kind of birds would be the only ones still standing. He had underlined right kind of birds. He had drawn, on the next page, a small, careful sketch of a mottled, rust-colored hen with a particular comb shape and a particular leg coloring, and below it he had written, "This is what they look like." Wren sat at the table, and she looked at the sketch, and she thought of the 957 birds in the long, low building, and she got up and walked out across the dark yard with a flashlight, and she shone the beam through the wire, and she stood there for a long time, because the birds in her grandfather's flock and the birds in her grandfather's sketch were, allowing for the variation of any heritage line, the same bird. She did not tell anyone what she had found, not even Edna, not yet. She went on as she had been going on, feeding twice a day, mucking the building once a week, watching the birds grow into themselves. In December, the first pullet laid an egg, a small brown one with a freckled shell, and Wren found it in the corner of the run and held it in her palm for a full minute before she put it in her coat pocket and walked it down the ridge to her grandmother's kitchen. Edna looked at the egg. She said, "Early." Wren said, "I know." Edna put the egg in a small bowl on the windowsill, and she did not eat it. And a week later, when Wren came down on Tuesday with the biscuit tin to return, the egg was still there, and it stayed there on the windowsill for the next 4 years. By February, the pullets were laying steadily, 2 and 3 dozen a day, and climbing, and Wren had built 3 small wooden boxes lined with straw, and had begun setting eggs out on a folding table at the end of the driveway, with a coffee can and a hand-lettered sign that said, $3 a dozen, eggs from heritage hens, exact change appreciated. The first week she sold 4 dozen, all of them to people who already knew her grandmother. The second week she sold 11. By the end of March she was selling 60 dozen a week and had to put a second table out, and Doris Hensley at the gas station had begun telling people who came in, asking about good eggs to drive on up to the Caldwell place on Burnt Fork, because that girl had something different. And one Saturday in April, a woman from Asheville drove up the ridge in a small white car and bought every egg Wren had and asked if she could come back next Saturday and buy that many again, because she was a chef and she had broken one of the eggs into a pan that morning, and the yolk had stood up like a small orange dome, and she had not seen a yolk do that in a restaurant kitchen in 15 years. Wren said she could come back. The woman came back. She brought another chef the next time, and the time after that she brought a man with a camera who took photographs of the long, low building and the mottled birds and the freckled eggs in their wooden boxes, and the photographs ended up in a magazine Wren had never heard of, and after that the cars coming up Burnt Fork Road on Saturdays were no longer only the cars of people Edna knew. Hollis Pemberton drove past the end of the driveway one Saturday in May and saw 7 cars parked along the gravel and a line of people standing at a folding table, and he slowed his truck almost to a stop, and then he sped up again and did not mention it at the feed store on Monday, although 3 other men did, and the conversation around the coffee pot that morning was the first conversation about Wren Caldwell at the feed store that did not contain the word funeral. The locusts came back the next summer. Not locusts the way the Bible meant locusts, but the way people in Madison County had begun to use the word, which was for the grasshoppers that had been thickening in the hayfields for 3 summers running, and that the county extension agent had spent the spring warning everybody about in a tone of voice that he tried to keep even and did not quite manage. The big operations down in the valley sprayed and sprayed, and the grasshoppers came anyway, in clouds that lifted off a cut field like smoke when you walked through it. And they ate the second cutting of hay down to stubble on the Pemberton place the 3rd week of July. And they ate the soybeans on the Tilson place the week after that, and the extension agent stopped trying to keep his voice even and started using the word infestation in the county paper. Wren read the paper at her grandmother's kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, and she set it down, and she walked back up the ridge, and she opened the south wall shutters of the long, low building all the way, and she let her birds out into the orchard for the first time. She had been holding them back. She had been letting them range only in the fenced run because the orchard sloped down toward the road, and she had worried about hawks and foxes and dogs. But the orchard had grasshoppers in it now, the kind of grasshoppers that rose in a green cloud when she walked the rows, and she had 940 birds in the long, low building, and she opened the door and she stood aside, and she watched them pour out into the grass like water finding its level. They did not need to be taught. They went at the grasshoppers the way a thing goes at the work it was made for, fanning out across the orchard in loose bands, the rust-colored ones and the dun ones and the slate ones all moving with the same low intent. And by sundown, the cloud that rose when Wren walked the rows was thinner, and by the end of the week it was gone, and the orchard grass was the only grass for a mile in any direction that had not been chewed to the dirt. Edna walked up the ridge on Tuesday morning with the biscuit tin, and she looked out across the orchard, and she said, "Your grandfather." Wren said, "I know." Edna said, "He told your father this was coming." Your father did not listen. I did not listen either. Wren did not say anything to that. She poured her grandmother a cup of coffee, and they sat on the porch, and they watched the birds work. And after a long while, Edna said, "You should let the Tilsons know." So Wren walked down the ridge that afternoon, and she knocked on the Tilsons' door, and she told the old man who answered that she had birds that ate grasshoppers, and that she could bring 100 of them down to his place for 2 weeks if he wanted. No charge. Just to see. And the old man looked at her the way men in Madison County had been looking at her for a year and a half, which was the look of a person trying to decide whether to laugh or to listen. And finally he said, "Bring them." She brought them. She loaded 100 birds into wire crates in the back of the old Ford, and she drove them down to the Tilson place, and she set up a portable electric fence around a half-acre of the worst of the soybean field, and she came back every other day for 2 weeks to move the fence and check the water. And at the end of the 2 weeks, the half-acre she had started with was clean of grasshoppers, and the soybean plants, which had not been entirely lost, had begun to put out new leaves. The old man stood at the edge of the field with his hat in his hand, and he looked at the new leaves for a long time, and he said, "What do I owe you?" Wren said, "Nothing." He said, "That ain't right." She said, "You can tell people it worked." He said, "I can do that." He did do that. He told it at the feed store the following Monday, in the slow, careful way old men in Madison County tell things they have decided are true. And the men around the coffee pot listened, because Henry Tilson was not a man who exaggerated. And when he was finished, one of them, a man named Buford Reeves, who farmed 200 acres of corn down on the river, said, "You reckon she'd bring some up to my place?" Henry said, "I reckon she would." She did. She brought 200 birds up to the Reeves place the following week, and 300 down to the McAllister farm the week after, and by the middle of August, she had birds rotating across 4 properties on portable electric fence, and she was charging $50 a week per 100 birds, which was the price Henry Tilson had told her quietly to charge after the first job, because, he said, free work makes people think the work is free. She listened. She had been listening to old men her whole life, when they were the right old men. She bought a second roll of electric fence with the first week's money, and a small solar charger with the second week's money, and a stock trailer, used, from a man over in Yancey County with the third week's money, and she did not borrow $1 for any of it, because her grandfather's notebook had a line in it from 1974 that said, "Debt is a man telling the future what it has to do, and the future does not like being told," and Wren had underlined that line in pencil the night she first read it, and had not unlearned it since. By September she had hired Caleb, the auctioneer's helper, who had turned 18 and had been looking for a way out of his father's house, and she paid him $12 an hour to move fence and haul water, which was $2 more than the feed store paid and $4 more than the auction barn paid, and Caleb worked harder for her than he had ever worked for anyone, because she did not speak to him the way men in Madison County spoke to boys, which was as though they were not quite there yet. She spoke to him as though he already was. Hollis Pemberton drove up the ridge on a Thursday afternoon in late September. He came alone, in his clean truck, and he parked at the edge of the yard, and he sat in the cab for almost a full minute before he got out, which Wren saw from the porch where she had been writing in the green notebook. She closed the notebook, and she set it on the railing, and she waited. He walked across the yard with his hat in his hand, which was not how he had walked at the auction barn, and he stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, and he looked up at her, and he said, "I came to ask about your birds." She said, "All right," he said. "I got 80 acres of hay that ain't going to make a second cutting if something don't change." She said, "I know." He said, "The spray ain't working." She said, "I know that, too." He stood there for a moment, with his hat in his hand, and she could see him working through the sentence he had come to say, and discarding 3 versions of it before he found the one he could stand to hear himself speak. He said, "I was wrong about them chicks." She did not answer right away. She let the sentence sit in the air between them for the length of time it had earned. Then she said, "How many acres did you say?" He said, 80. She said, "I can put 400 birds on you starting Monday. 200 a week, 6 weeks to clear it if the weather holds. $200 a week." He said, "That's fair." She said, "I know it's fair." He almost smiled at that. He almost did. He put his hat back on his head, and he said, "I appreciate it, Miss Caldwell." And he turned and walked back to his truck, and he did not make a large production out of any of it, which was, Wren understood, the closest thing to an apology a man like Hollis Pemberton knew how to make. She watched him drive down the ridge, and she picked up the green notebook, and she wrote his name in the column on the right, and the column on the right was longer than the column on the left now, and had been for 2 months, and she sat on the porch until the light went out of the mountains, and she did not feel triumphant exactly, but she felt the weight of the thing shift on her shoulders, the way a coat shifts when you have finally put your arms through the sleeves. The Pemberton job ran the 6 weeks she had said it would. The birds cleared the hayfield down to clean stubble, and the third cutting, which Hollis had given up on entirely, came in thin, but it came in, and Hollis paid her in cash on the last Friday, and he stood at the gate of the portable fence, and he watched the birds work for a long time, and he said, "Your grandfather built the wrong kind of barn on purpose, didn't he?" Wren said, "He built the right kind." Hollis nodded. He said, "That's what I meant." By the second year, she had 2,000 birds and was running 4 crews on 4 properties, and had hired 2 more people, besides Caleb, a woman named Marlin, who had lost her job at the sewing plant when it closed, and a boy named Eli, who was Caleb's cousin, and who had a way with the birds that Wren recognized from her grandfather's notebook, which was the way of a person who watches before he moves. She did not expand faster than the demand pulled her. She did not take the small business loan the bank in Marshall offered her when word of the operation reached them, although the loan officer drove up the ridge twice to make the offer in person, and the second time brought a folder with her name already typed on it. She thanked him both times, and she did not sign. She bought a second stock trailer with cash in the spring and a third in the fall, and she built a second long, low building on the footprint of the collapsed tobacco barn, using chestnut salvaged from a barn that was coming down over in Mitchell County, and she built it to her grandfather's design, with the vents at the particular height and the floor on cedar sleepers, and the southern wall hung with shutters that could be raised and lowered by a single rope. Caleb helped her frame it. Eli helped her shingle the roof. Marlene built the nest boxes in the workshop in the evenings, working from a drawing in the green notebook that Wren had copied out of her grandfather's hand. They finished the building in October of the second year, and they moved 1,000 birds into it the first week of November. And that night, Wren sat on the porch with her grandmother, and they looked out across the yard at the two long, low buildings standing parallel in the moonlight. And Edna said he would have liked to see it. Wren said, "I think he is seeing it." Edna did not answer that, but she reached over and put her hand on Wren's hand on the arm of the rocking chair, and she left it there, and they sat that way until the cold drove them inside. Edna died in February of the third year. She died in her sleep in the small frame house at the bottom of the ridge, with the egg from the first laying still on the windowsill in the bowl where she had set it 4 years before, and Wren found her on a Tuesday morning when she came down with the biscuit tin to return. She sat on the edge of her grandmother's bed for a long time, and she did not cry. Not then, because crying was not a thing that had come to her yet, and she walked through the small frame house room by room, and she touched the things her grandmother had touched, the coffee pot and the radio and the brown coveralls hanging on the peg by the back door, and on the kitchen table she found an envelope with her own name on it in her grandmother's careful slanting hand, which was the same hand her grandfather had written in, because they had learned to write at the same one-room school in 1932. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 lines on it. The first line said, "The house is yours." The second line said, "The books in the trunk are yours." The third line said, "Tell Caleb." That was all. Tell Caleb. No explanation, no object, no instruction, no further word. Wren folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket, and she walked back up the ridge to call the funeral home, and the open loop of those 2 words sat in her pocket for 3 days while she made the arrangements and met with the minister and stood at the front of the small church in Marshall, where her grandmother had sat in the 3rd pew for 61 years. She did not tell Caleb anything, because she did not yet know what there was to tell. The funeral was on a Saturday. Hollis Pemberton came. Henry Tilson came. Buford Reeves came. Doris Hensley came and brought a casserole. The old man who had sold Wren the first stock trailer drove down from Yancey County. The chef from Asheville came in her small white car and stood at the back of the church and did not speak to anyone, but signed the guest book in a careful hand. Caleb came in a suit that did not fit him, because it had been his father's, and he sat in the 2nd row beside Marlene and Eli, and after the service he stood by the grave with his hands folded in front of him, and he did not know what to do with his face. Wren walked over to him. She said, "My grandmother left a note." He looked at her. She said, "It said, 'Tell Caleb.'" He waited. She said, "I do not know what she meant." He thought about it for a moment, the way he thought about everything, which was slowly and without performance. And then he said, "She used to come up to the building when I was working alone in the evenings. She would stand in the doorway and watch me move the birds. She did not say much." Wren said, "What did she say?" Caleb said, "She said one time, 'You have the hands.' She said, 'You are the one.'" I did not know what she meant either. They stood there at the edge of the grave, and they looked at each other, and they understood, both of them at the same moment, what Edna had been telling them in her economical way, which was that the operation was not going to belong only to Wren forever, and that when the time came, there was a person already standing in the doorway with the hands for it, and that Edna had seen it before either of them had, the way she had seen everything before anyone else had, because she had been watching for 82 years and had learned what to look for. Wren did not say anything else to Caleb that day. She did not need to. She put her hand on his shoulder, and she walked back to the truck, and she drove home up the ridge, and the next Monday morning she gave him a key to the workshop and a copy of the green notebook she had been keeping, and she did not make a ceremony of it. By the 4th year the operation had a name, although Wren had not given it one, and resisted giving it one for as long as she could. The chef from Asheville had begun calling it Burnt Fork in the menus at her restaurant, and the magazine that had photographed the birds the first spring had called it Burnt Fork Heritage in the caption, and after a while it was easier to let the name be the name than to keep correcting people. She had 4,000 birds now, in 4 long, low buildings, 3 of them new, and built to her grandfather's specification by Caleb and Eli, and a small rotating crew of local men who had come looking for work, and had been hired in the order they came. She ran 6 grazing crews across 11 properties in 3 counties, and she sold eggs on Saturdays from a stand that had grown from 1 folding table to a small open-sided shed at the bottom of the driveway, with a chalkboard sign and a hand-painted price list. And she had begun, in the 2nd year, selling birds for meat as well, processed in a small certified facility she had built behind the new building, with the same patient, cash-only method she had used for everything else. The birds for meat were the older hens past their best laying years, dressed out small and dark-fleshed, and sold to the chefs in Asheville, and a handful in Knoxville, and one in Charleston, who drove up twice a year in a van with his name on the side, and the meat went for a price that would have made Hollis Pemberton drop his coffee cup if Wren had ever told him, which she did not, because there was no need. The grasshoppers came back the 4th summer, worse than they had come back the 2nd. The extension agent stopped pretending it was anything other than what it was, and the county paper ran a front-page article that used the word crisis, and the big operations down in the valley sprayed twice as much as they had sprayed the year before, and lost their hay anyway. And the phone in the kitchen at the top of the ridge rang from 7 in the morning until 9 at night for 2 weeks straight, and Wren took every call and wrote every name in the green notebook and turned away no one, although she had to schedule some of them out into October, because there were only so many birds and so many crews and so many hours of light. She did not raise her prices. She had been asked, more than once, why she did not, and her answer was always the same, which was that the price was fair, and a fair price did not need to move with the weather. Henry Tilson had told her that too, the first summer, and she had listened, the way she had listened to all the right old men. She drove down to the auction barn in Madison County the 3rd week of August that 4th summer. She had not been back since the morning she had bought the chicks, 4 years and 4 months before, and she did not have a reason to go now, except that she had heard, from Doris Hensley at the gas station, that the hatchery up in Tennessee was sending another mixed lot of heritage chicks down to be sold, and that the auctioneer was not expecting any bids. She drove the old Ford, which still ran, although the engine had taken on the habit of composing its own obituary at idle, and she parked it in the same gravel lot where she had parked it before, and she walked into the barn through the same wide door. The fluorescent lights were the same, the smell was the same. The auctioneer was the same man, 4 years greyer, and he looked up when she came in, and he nodded at her, the way he nodded at people he knew were going to buy something. She walked past the calf pens. She walked past the goats. She walked all the way to the back where the cardboard flats sat under the same buzzing fluorescent, and she crouched down on her heels, and she looked at the chicks for a long time, without saying anything. There were 800 of them this time. They peeped in the thin, uneven way chicks peep when they are cold and underfed, and 2 of them were already not moving, and the men at the front of the barn had not bothered to walk back. Caleb was with her. He had ridden down in the passenger seat and had not asked where they were going, because he had learned in 3 years of working for her that she would say when she had something to say. He crouched down beside her now, and he looked at the chicks, and after a minute he said, "The rust-colored ones have your grandfather's leg coloring." She said, "I know." He said, "How much do you want to pay?" She said, "Whatever they ask." They asked $30. She paid 40, because it had been 40 the first time, and she was, in a way she did not entirely understand, and did not try to, paying a debt. She and Caleb loaded the flats into the bed of the Ford, one at a time, the same way she had loaded them alone 4 years before, and as she closed the tailgate, she heard a voice behind her, and she turned, and Hollis Pemberton was standing there in a Carhartt jacket that was no longer clean, because he had driven over from a hayfield, and he had his hat in his hand the way he had carried it the afternoon he came up the ridge. He said, "I heard you were coming down." She said, "News travels." He said, "Those are the ones, aren't they?" She said, "Those are the ones." He looked at the flats in the bed of the truck, and he looked at her, and he said, "Your grandfather would be proud." She said, "I think he is." Hollis nodded. He said, "I'll see you Monday." She said, "Monday." He walked back to his own truck and he drove out of the lot, and Wren got in the cab beside Caleb, and she sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel, and she looked through the windshield at the barn she had walked out of 4 years before with 1,000 birds nobody wanted, and she felt finally the thing she had not let herself feel that first morning, which was not triumph and not vindication, but something quieter and older than either, which was the feeling of a person who has been told what she has is not worth much, and who has lived long enough to watch the world correct itself. She started the truck. The engine composed a stanza of its obituary, and then settled. She drove out of the lot with Caleb beside her, and 800 chicks peeping behind her, and she took the long road home, past the Tilson place, and across the creek twice, and up the gravel switchbacks to the ridge where her grandfather had built the farmhouse in 1948 out of chestnut, salvaged from a barn that had stood on the same footprint for 60 years before him, and the house was still standing, and so was the long, low building he had built for these, and so were 3 more beside it now, and so was she. She carried the flats one at a time into the original building, the one her grandfather had built, and she set them on the wooden floor he had laid, and she lit the brooder lamps, and she stood in the cool dim with the smell of old straw and older wood, and she listened to 800 chicks she had paid $40 for, and she did not feel afraid, and she did not feel the weight of the thing settle on her shoulders, because the weight had become, somewhere in the 4 years between this morning and the first, simply the shape of her shoulders. Caleb stood in the doorway, and he watched her for a moment, and then he went out to fill the water troughs without being asked, because he had the hands, and he was the one, and Edna had known it before either of them had. If this story has stayed with you, do one thing for me. Share it with someone who has been told that what they have, or what they are holding on to, or what they see worth in, is not worth much. Tell them about Wren. Tell them about the 1,000 chicks nobody wanted, and then come back down here to the comments and tell me about the thing in your own life that everybody laughed at, the small, stubborn thing you kept on with anyway, and tell me where you are watching from, what town, what country, what road. I read every comment, every one. I will read yours.